Welcome to Liesel's Artistic Studio. Today I'm going to show you a few of the basics for the beginning watercolor artist using simple and inexpensive watercolors, which you might even already have at home. Let's get started. For our supplies today, we need a watercolor set. And I have this one that you can pretty much find in any store. These are ones that kids usually use, but they work just fine if you're just testing, experimenting, and just starting out painting with watercolors. However, they do have their limitations. So if you decide that watercolor painting is something that you enjoy and would like to pursue, then I definitely would recommend getting a more professional set of paints in the future. Now, this set does come with a brush. Again, it will work for today, but this is also something that I would replace in the future, probably even before the paints. These brushes often have loose hairs that come out onto your painting, and sometimes they don't have a very good shape, which makes painting hard. For example, today, for the techniques we're going to try, it would be best to have a round brush that comes to a fine point at the end. These cheap brushes sometimes have a pretty flat tip. So for today, you can give the cheap brush a try if that's all you have, but if you happen to have a better brush lying around the house, then pull it out. We also will be needing some watercolor paper to paint on. Watercolor paper is very thick and it is made to handle a lot of water. It has a bit of texture to it, which helps catch and hold your pigment, where thin paper will leak through and it can become wavy and warped if you're using a lot of water. You can usually find a booklet of watercolor paper with a lot of sheets similar to this. This has 30 sheets of paper for maybe $10 to $20. This is the book I like to use for smaller projects or painting practice. The paper inside is able to tear out easily as well. If you don't have watercolor paper today, you can use a substitute like white cardstock. But watercolor paper is a must when it comes to watercolor painting. We will also be using and needing a paper towel and 1 or even 2 cups of clean water and a scrap piece of paper that you can test your colors on. At any time during this tutorial, if you need more time to practice or finish your work, feel free to pause or rewind at any time. To start out today, let's cover 2 of the main terms you will hear and use when painting with watercolors. The first is called wet on wet painting, which means that your paper will already be wet before you add more water or wet paint to it. Wet on wet works really well for blending colors, making backgrounds, and filling in large spaces. Let's give it a try. First, take your brush and dip it into your water. And paint a square on your paper with only water. Next, dip your brush in water and choose a color and wet down that color generously with water until it starts to fill your brush. The first thing I want you to do is just take the tip of your brush and just touch it to the wet part of your paper and watch how the pigment and water react and spread. All right, let's add more color and fill the space that you have already painted with water. Now let's try this again, only let's use multiple colors this time. So go ahead and paint another wet square on your paper, and this time pick 2 or 3 different colors and start adding it anywhere on your wet square, and let's watch and see how they react and blend together. When you fill a large space or background using this technique, it is commonly known as a wash. And it's really neat to watch the colors blend and work together. This is something really cool that watercolors can do. Now when you're painting, you might notice that the colors will start to pool or seep into one area. If they do this, dry off your brush and just lay your brush right there on the colors that's seeping and dab it off onto your paper towel. And that will soak off any excess water or color. The next term you will hear and use is called wet on dry, meaning this time your paper will be dry before you add wet paint to it. Even if you've already put paint on your paper or created a wash, it should be dry before using this technique, or as we just saw, the colors will naturally start to blend together, which you may not want. The times that you will probably use the wet on dry method is when you're wanting a more crisp, bold, or dark look. Wet on dry is often used when you're working on the details of your painting. Now, using the wet on dry technique, let's try out a few simple brush strokes. Get your brush full of paint and let's just try a nice thick straight line. Press your brush down, keep your wrist straight, and use your whole arm to draw your line. Try it a few times. Next, let's try a thin line. This may take a little more practice. Fill your brush with the color. Now dab the tip of your brush gently on your paper towel and take off any excess paint or water. Now using only the tip of your brush so it is barely touching your paper and using the same arm motion as before, swiftly draw your line. Try not to hesitate, be confident, and just go. Give this a try a few times. Now let's combine those two lines and create a wavy line by using thick and thin lines. So load your brush and let's start with a thin line. We are going to slowly press down and then slowly lift up. And again, press down and up, down and up. Keep repeating until you have a nice wavy line. Now let's try to create some simple leaves and petals. The first one we're going to try is what I call a one-stroke leaf petal technique. This will be similar to our wavy line, but instead of continuing the line, we will just do the stroke once. For example, load your brush, start out lightly, press down and lift up, and end with a nice point. This can be tricky at first, but keep giving it a try. You will get the hang of it. Keep in mind also that if you're using a cheap brush like this, this will be a little harder to do than if you're using a brush that has a nice point. Next, let's try some thicker leaves or petals. This is what I like to call the two-stroke leaf or petal technique. You'll basically start off the same way as this last stroke, but we will do this in more of a curve or a slight semicircle, and then we'll add another curve to the other side, like this. This will create a slightly different shape, and it gives you the potential to make it any thickness or shape that you desire rather than all what your brush will allow. Try this out a few times. All right, now that you know a few of the basics, you can actually start to create your own artwork right now. Let's try these 3 simple paintings together using the techniques we just learned. Now, using some clean water, let's start with doing a wash for the flower painting. This piece of paper I'm using is half of a watercolor paper sheet. I recommend taping this paper down to your work surface because we will be doing a wash background, and having it taped can help it from warping when you're adding lots of water. You can just use painter's tape or masking tape, but if your tape seems really sticky, rub it on your clothes or something and get some lint stuck on it. Make sure that it's a little less sticky when you put it on your paper so it won't tear your artwork when you peel it off. So we will be doing a background with the wet on wet technique. First, you need to wet your entire paper with water. If you have a bigger brush, that would speed up this process. Now I'm going to paint my background a really light yellow color, but you are the artist for your work and you can choose any color you'd like. But you do want to keep it fairly light so it won't overpower your flowers. When you're ready to do your wash, just do it exactly like we did before. Get your color wet and start adding it to your paper, pushing the paint around. You can add more water if needed. If you notice that your water is starting to pool on your corners of your picture, you can dry your brush off, lightly dab at where the water is pooling, and you can dry that off. Now, while we let that sit and dry, let's paint the background for our bamboo painting. I'm going to use another half sheet of watercolor paper for this painting as well. We will again be doing a wet on wet wash for the background. So again, tape your paper down that's not too sticky. Once as your paper's taped, paint your paper with water only first and then add your color. Now I'm choosing to paint this background as a gradient. So I'm going to start the top of the painting with a light yellow and slowly move it down to about halfway or maybe 3/4 of the page. Then I'm going to put some red on the bottom and work it up until the yellow and the red start to blend and combine. If you notice that your color is too dark, keep adding water, or you can use your paper towel and start dabbing some of it out and start over. While we let that dry, let's work on our wreath painting. I'm choosing not to do a background wash on this one, but you can if you'd like, and just follow the same steps as the last two. For the wreath, I have a square piece of watercolor paper, and to get this started, because I want it to be nice and round, I'm going to first draw a circle on my paper using a pencil and something round. Now I want to paint my wreath green, but to me, the green that comes in these cheap sets is not a very realistic color of green. So what I'm going to do is take some green paint and start to apply it to the lid that's connected to the watercolor set. Just continue adding water and paint to the tray until you have a good amount of color. Now, to give the green a more realistic and natural look, we're going to add just a slight touch of red to your green. This will help just tone it down and give it a more natural look. Now, when mixing colors, you are going to want to test this out. So we have our test paper here. You're going to want to test out your new green color. If you feel like that color is now too brown, all you have to do is add a little bit more green. If you feel it's still too green, add a little bit more red. Just keep testing out that color until you get the color that you like. After you have your desired color, then we will start to add our leaves using the one-stroke leaf technique that we learned earlier. Now I want all of my leaves to move in the same direction, so I will just slowly start to turn my paper as I go. It's a good idea also to not have all of your leaves exactly the same size. Some can be bigger, some can be smaller, some can be darker or lighter. Having different sizes of leaves and different colors will help add interest to your painting. Now once you have all of your leaves painted on there, you have a choice. You can, after it's dry, erase your pencil so it's just the leaves, or you can use some of your green color and paint that green line. I'm going to go ahead and paint my line. Once as your wreath is dry, you can be creative with what you want to do with it. You could paint or draw words in the center of the wreath. You could add berries and make it look Christmassy like this. You could add a bow or paint flowers on it. Whatever you want to try.
Let's move back to the flower painting. If your wash isn't dry yet, you can give it more time, or you can use a hairdryer to speed up the drying process a little bit. But we will be using the wet on dry technique, so your paper does need to be dry before we start adding our flowers. First, let's start with the center of the flower. Pick a spot on your paper and use yellow, orange, or a little of both. Just dab at your paper, making little dots that sort of run into each other a little bit. Next, we're going to add the petals. Now you can choose to let the center of your flower dry before you add the petals, or you can start adding the petals while the center is wet. And that will make the center of the flower and the petals sort of blend with each other, which I think looks pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and add my petals while the center is still wet. This time, I want my petals to be a little thicker than my brush will allow, so I'm mostly going to use the 2-stroke leaf and petal technique. If you're nervous to jump right into the flower, feel free to practice it on a piece of scratch paper first. Because I want the center of my flower to slightly blend more with the petals, I'm going to add just a touch more of the orange and yellow. Next, I'm going to use my clean and dry brush to dab the center of the flower to create a small highlight. I would like to have more than one flower in my picture, so I'm going to do the same thing over again until I get the look I want. But you are the artist here, so do what looks good to you. And don't get frustrated if your painting doesn't turn out quite right the first time. It just takes some practice. So don't be afraid to try this painting over again if you need to. After I have my flowers the way I want, I'm going to use the same green color that I used on my wreath painting, and I'm going to add a thin line for the stem of the flower, and using the one-stroke leaf method, some long leaves coming from the bottom of the stem. Once as the flowers are dry, I'm going to add some more orange dots to the bottom of the center of the flower to give it a little bit of detail. Let's go back to the dry bamboo background. It's time to add the bamboo. First, we'll start with the stems of the bamboo. I'm going to add mine at sort of an angle to give it more interest. Next, I'm going to add a few joints to the stem. Then, using nice thin lines, create some thin branches coming out of the bamboo joints you just painted. Remember to lightly dab your loaded brush onto a paper towel to help keep the lines thin. After you have all the stems and branches you want, start adding on leaves to your branches using the one-stroke leaf method. Continue adding until you're satisfied with the look of your painting. If you want to add some extra dimension to your painting, paint over a few of the leaves again to make them darker. This will help them look like they're more forward in the painting. Or you could slightly water down the color of your green and add some leaves that are lighter. This will make them look like they're more in the background. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe to my channel so I can help you continue to explore your artistic side.